When I started the military psychological services at Duquesne, I started reading a hell of a lot, and I read some fantastic books, especially the books by Jonathan Shea. One was called Achilles in Vietnam, which I think still is the best book I ever read. Achilles
Yeah.
in Vietnam by Jonathan Shea. He was a psychiatrist working in Boston, and he was working with all the veterans that the VA had rejected because they were too disorganized, so-called unreliable, and so on. He was working with veterans on the streets. And then the other one was Ed Tick, who worked with veterans since 1973. He was an anti-Vietnam War activist, but he never took it out on the soldiers themselves. He thought that the soldiers should be treated with honor. When he started working with veterans, he had two dreams in which Sitting Bull came to him and said, "If you want to work with veterans, you must learn my people's ways." So he took himself off. He was a self-described Jewish kid from Brooklyn, and he took himself off to South Dakota. This is in the 1970s. He took himself off to South Dakota onto the Lakota Sioux Native Reservation, where he met Sitting Bull's great niece. She was
Wow.
she was still alive, and she was also a healer. And she said that Sitting Bull, he's known in the white man's world as this great warrior chief, but in their own culture, he was the healer. Sitting Bull used to say, "If my people suffer from the mental and spiritual wounds of war, then his culture won't survive." So
Yeah.
He learned that the Native Americans had these series of rituals which were designed to bring the wounded warriors home. And she said, "I will teach you." And so she taught him the ways of the traditional ways of the Plains Indians for treating what we call PTSD. And what he learned is that what we call PTSD as a psychiatric condition is well known in all traditional warrior cultures. And they don't see it they don't kind of interpret it as a psychiatric condition. That's a very modern, in fact, it's only about 50 years old that we called it a psychiatric condition, maybe going back to World War One. But in all those traditional warrior cultures, what we call PTSD is understood as a moral and spiritual wound to the soul. It's not like other trauma, like tsunamis and car crashes and sexual assault and stuff. It's because it has to do with killing and
Yes.
the trauma and the moral and spiritual trauma of killing. So it's a completely different category. And if all we do is look at the symptoms like the agitation, or do you have nightmares? Yes. Uh, Not looking at what are the nightmares, it's just, do you have nightmares? Do you have agitation? Do you have difficulty getting on with people? Are you afraid of crowds? But all those all those diagnostic questions for PTSD miss the moral and spiritual wound to the soul, which is how it's always understood. So he learned those rituals and he brought them back into his training model, into the way he would work with veterans. I'll come to it in a bit more about that in just a moment. He also found similar, basically the same rituals in the Maoris in New Zealand, the ancient Celts in Britain, the Christians coming back from the Crusades in 1000 or whenever the Crusades were. I went and I found that the Xhosa in South Africa called it the Kaneni, which was translated to me as a special kind of knowledge. And he said it's the knowledge that the veteran has. It's the shadow that follows him around, never letting him forget what he's done, which is an incredible image of for the what the Xhosa call PTSD is this shadow that follows you around, never letting you forget what you've done. The Zulus called it the ukuhlanya, which is to wander around without direction, without one's moral compass. You're kind of lost. And it means it both in a geographical sense, but also spiritually and morally. You're just wandering around like a ghost in your own body. In all these traditional warrior cultures, there was a series of rituals to bring them home. And the rituals essentially, first of all, there needs to be a period of isolation. You can't just take a person from the battlefield and send him straight home. And in the States, after the military, what they then learned is you don't people send warriors home. You let them go for a weekend pass, but then you bring them back to base and you keep them there for a month or 6 weeks or something. When the 101st Airborne got back from their first tour in Afghanistan, 6 men killed their wives over the next 6 weeks. And it's not a new story. The story of the ancient Greek hero Heracles was that he was so happy to be home. And so he had a big barbecue for his family. Then he hallucinated them as the enemy and he killed them all. And then he came out of his hallucination and he realized the horror of what he had done, that he had killed his family. And that story is now 2,500 years old. So this is not a new story. These are not new stories. So the first one is isolation. The next thing is the civilian society needs to come around and take care of the warrior in the same way and with the same dedication that the warrior has taken care of the society by fighting for it and defending it. So it is now the civilians' turn to take care of the warriors. Is making peace with the dead. And that means making peace with the enemy dead too. We often sort of see like the Plains Indians, if they killed a buffalo or something, they would give thanks to the spirit of the buffalo and honor the spirit of the buffalo, while they then make use of it for clothing and food and everything. What isn't so well known is that the Native Americans had the same requirement for honoring the enemy dead. So they had to take care of the spirits of all the dead, including the enemy dead. That was the same all over the world. For the Xhosa, the way the Xhosa would frame it in their own sort of culture would be that when you have killed in battle, the moral order, the ancestors, the moral order that is held by the ancestors has been violated. And the warrior's soul is left on the battlefield. And he can never come home. His soul is left on the battlefield until he's made peace with the enemy dead and all the dead. I think of the guy who came to the clinic once and he literally wondered if he had been killed in Afghanistan, but he didn't realize it yet. Of course, he told a psychiatrist at the VA, and the psychiatrist rightly thought he sounds depressed, but that's missing the point. He's not going to respond to an antidepressant. He was dissociated. I mean, he was here, he was in the VA, and he wonders if he's dead and in Afghanistan. That's not depression. That's something else. I said, the Native Americans would know exactly what you're describing, and so would the Xhosa, where I come from in South Africa. The Xhosa would say that your soul has been left on the battlefield because you haven't yet made peace with the dead.
There was a chap in Viet, sorry to interrupt, Roger, at the memorial in DC where the guy was looking for a name.
His name, he was looking for his own name. It's exactly the same story. By
Yeah.
the way, that story I came from Jonathan Shea in his book Achilles in Vietnam. I think it was him, or it might have been Ed Tick. Ed Tick, who wrote War and the Soul, which is a really good book. So anyway, I then studied with Ed Tick and I studied with him very intensely for a week. And then he really liked the fact that I was a veteran and I was also a clinical psychologist. I had a lot more clinical experience than he did. And so we hit it off. Then found myself on the board of directors. At one point, I was even president of the organization that he founded called Soldier's Heart. It was a national-wide organization, but it wasn't well organized. He didn't run it very well. He was a very great visionary, but he wasn't a great manager. We then ran a lot of retreats together, which was civilians and warrior and veterans together, sometimes over maybe 24 people or even up to 30 people. And they were these 4-day retreats where we would take these Native American rituals and we'd ritualize them into a 4-day retreat. But even, that's we would have a time when we'd like put the veterans in the circle and we'd have all the civilians walk around them and welcoming them home. And you'd see these veterans start to cry. Veterans who thought that civilians would not want to hear them at all. You'd see these veterans, these civilians genuinely wanting to hear and saying, I'll be there for you, and were there for them. So it would be things like that, making peace with the dead. And we would say things like, you tell me about how do you remember the dead? And they'd of course talk about dead buddies and things like that. But I'd say, but then mostly they would just spontaneously say, I'll never forget the face of that young kid I shot. I fired into the bushes, and when I got there, I saw he was just a kid, man. He was probably he was probably my age or younger than me, and here I am. I'm now in my 30s, and he was 17 or something. And every night I just see him, or every day I'm just sort of chatting with friends, and suddenly his face pops up. I'll say, right, so there's a way in which he's calling for your attention. What do you, and so I'd then say, what do you want to say to him? I'd say, let him come to mind. What do you want to say to him? And and then he'd start a conversation, and he'd say, Ahmed, I'm just so sorry. I'm so sorry. I wish you could live a life. I wish I could meet you again. And then I'd say, okay, just wait there. Let him, is he hearing you? And then I'd say, wait until he hears you. And then I want to see, how does he respond? This is a work of imagination, but I don't get into the question of whether it's real or is it a ghost or I just let it be what it is. I don't try to analyze it. I just let it be what it is. And I'd say, what does he say to you? And without fail, the dead enemy will just smile and say, I want you to live your life or go in peace or something. And what we find is that these veterans find that they don't forget that face afterwards, but the face is with them like a guardian angel. It's like a supportive presence, instead of being this terrifying presence that haunts their nightmares and dreams. So it's like it just changes completely. For example, I remember a Marine who was so traumatized by the sight of a little girl. She was maybe 8 or 10 years old in Iraq. And he said he had drunk a swimming pool of vodka since then to try to erase that memory, but he couldn't. Now, he hadn't even killed her. I think that she stood out of all the death there. She stood out because she was a kind of a symbol of the feminine that had been murdered in him and in that country, and the feminine that is murdered in war. And as a kind of a symbol for all that innocence and the innocence within him and within his mates and the innocence of life that was murdered. So she sort of really stood out as the perfect symbol of all that. And he did this dialogue with her. And about 6 months later, he sent me an email. A very strange thing's happened. He stopped drinking. And he said she's no longer, she said, I still remember her and I think of her nearly every day, but she's like a guardian angel. And I've got a daughter who's her age, and I pray to this to ask for guidance on how to be a better father. And so this dead Iraqi girl becomes a kind of a symbol for him that he can be in dialogue with about what his daughter might need from him and how to be a better father. So the dead, even the dead enemy, often can become these kind of guardian presences that actually can enrich our lives. Sometimes it's that, I know I'll remember you for the every day for the rest of my life, but I want to remember you as a friend. One was an extraordinary, it was a dead buddy. This buddy was dying, and he kept saying to his buddy, it's okay, you'll be fine, just hang in there. And he knew he was lying. And what he couldn't get over was his buddy was looking at him, saying in his eyes, it was as though he was saying, I know you're lying to me. And then he died. And this Marine was absolutely traumatized. I mean, he was profoundly suicidal and drunk that at the end he had lied to his buddy who was dying in his arms. So instead of just having this thing which you're trying to get away, I said, okay, let him come to mind now. Let him come to mind. And he came to mind. I said, what would you like to say to him? He says, I'm so sorry I lied to you. And he talked a bit about that. And then what's he wanting to, you say he's looking at you. What is he actually trying to say to you? You can see he's trying to mouth something. What's he trying to say? And the answer shook him to his foundations. His buddy was trying to say, don't let this kill you. He wasn't accusing him at all. He was just trying to say, don't let this kill you. That was 10 years ago. And I know this Marine, he was totally transformed by that. Again, his dead buddy is like a guardian angel that he remembers with honor. And sometimes veterans will then plant a tree in a dead buddy's name and bring the family in. So like the Marine with his 10-year-old daughter, he planted a tree in the name of all the civilians who died in Iraq. And then he would tell on Memorial Day, he would tell his daughter, okay, this tree is for all those little girls and children who were killed in the war, and I'm remembering them, and let's say a prayer to them, a prayer to them together, and his daughter would pray for them together. The depth of healing that comes from that is absolutely unbelievable, as I'm sure you can believe, being a Christian man yourself. The other thing that, and the next theme, I just want to roll on quickly. The next theme is that veterans who sort of huddle around with other veterans and say you can't trust civilians, and it gives a kind of support, but you'll never come home like that. Ultimately, we have to risk trusting civilians, not all civilians, but some civilians. We have to trust them with our story because our memories, in a way, our memories are bigger than us. You remember people who deserve to be remembered. We say we'll never forget. They will be forgotten when we die. So it's important that our memories are carried by the next generation. Something that I would always often say was that the impact of war will be transferred to the civilian community and the next generation. The challenge is to pass it on to the next generation as a story that can be told. Then the kids can understand. And then it becomes part of a family legacy. And God, Dad went through this and so on, and you tell, etc., etc. It's then a story and it makes sense. And I feel like I know my dad better. Your son will know you better. Your daughters will too. And so that the story gets passed on as a family legacy and as a cultural legacy. If you don't pass it on as a story, it will be passed on by impact. And the best example I know of that, so that's why for the Native Americans and the Xhosa and all those cultures, the veterans would come home and they would tell the story of the battle and the war. They would tell the story to the civilian community, and their responsibility was to tolerate the pain of it and take responsibility for the violence that was done in its name, so that the warrior, no matter what he's done, no matter what the warrior has done, it is recognized that his violence should not be carried by himself. His memories shouldn't be carried by himself. We need to bring his memories home so that the memories and the language of it are carried by the civilian community. And by the way, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, you remember that? That came
I
out of
do.
the Xhosa tradition called the Ukabula. And the Ukabula was when the warriors would come home and the civilians would take responsibility for the violence and say, we're not going to let you carry the burden of this violence. We are going to carry the burden as a society. And that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did. Whether you were
Right.
in the CCB, or in the PAC murdering people or whatever the hell. If you came to the commission, the civilian community would take responsibility for the violence. There was a point where Bishop Tutu broke down in tears because he was so overwhelmed. Remember that? He broke down in tears and they asked him, would you like to stop? And he said, no, we must bear this. This is our responsibility. And that is that tradition which was held in the Native American cultures. You see all those warrior paintings on the teepees and things. That's communication in writing to the civilian community. So certainly veterans groups are fine with veterans only, but ultimately the veterans need to tell their story to the civilian community. Now, in our psychotherapy program, in our counseling program at Duquesne University, the civilian community is represented by the civilian therapist, who's a doctoral student, a graduate student, listening to a veteran and letting the veteran put it into his words, putting his experience into the language of his mother tongue. And the mother tongue is the language of community. And she, the civilian therapist, is helping him find words for his experience. And in that way, in a very immediate way, is bringing his language and his experience home and tolerating the burden of it. I saw there's a wonderful Jack Merchant. He was this old Green Beret in the mountains of Vietnam for 3 years. I mean, it's like out of Apocalypse Now kind of stuff. And Jack Merchant had a young civilian therapist. And both of them were transformed. She didn't want to work with veterans. She was scared of veterans and she was a liberal and she thought they're all crazy or something and she's just for scared. She now is a senior psychologist in the Veterans Administration in California, where she is running a network, a rural network with a wide radius for hundreds of women traumatized veterans. She just dedicated her life to veterans. She did her PhD on sexual assault in the military, and on her dissertation was on sexual assault and so on. And Jack Merchant and her were totally transformed by the experience. You have to, veterans in all these traditional warrior cultures, one of the questions the veteran must ask is how can I make the world better? How can I repair? And all the veterans who do well continue to be of service to the community. It is a basic truism that once you have had military service, you will never simply be a civilian again. And especially if you've been marked, as I say, you've been marked, and that's not good or bad, it's just true. And any attempt to try to simply pretend it all didn't happen and just throw yourself back into civilian life drunkenly, that doesn't have a good destiny. So the what you have to do is what I said to my son, coming home is going to be harder than going to war. And it's going to take the same level of discipline and commitment, and it's going to take a long time. And you need to prepare yourself for homecoming as a journey that you have to
Your
work at.
son, your son served in the
He was in
US
Iraq.
military.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my son was in Iraq every year from 2004 to 2009. It was 3 tours. He estimated he was in about 300 firefights.
No way.
Yeah, he was in 3 Humvees that were blown up underneath him. And so, yeah, he was in the thick of it. He was in that Ramadi Fallujah area, and then he was in eastern Baghdad through the whole surge and everything. So he was first on the scene of 2 massive Al Qaeda bomb blasts in Shia neighborhoods, where he was the first platoon. His was the first platoon to arrive on the scene. He remembers holding a little boy in one arm and his leg in the other arm, running around looking for a medic, and his mother was screaming, and just absolute horror. So he went through the thick of it, man. So anyway, I said to him, homecoming it's a task, and one of the things that you need to do is for redemption. Like you did, you became a minister and you went and worked in Angola, if I remember. I mean, and by the way, you are in a great tradition. Do you know that St. Francis of Assisi was a combat veteran
Wow. I didn't know that.
on 2 tours? And in his second tour, he broke down. And he broke down. After his first tour, he didn't fit in with his family. They all said, welcome home. And he thought, no, I don't feel at home and all. I don't know what the hell to do. So he went and re-enlisted. In his second tour, he had a breakdown, a complete psychological breakdown, which of course they would have wanted to treat with medication and therapy and stuff. But he saw it as an opportunity for a spiritual transformation, and which gave the birth to the Franciscan order. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits, he was a combat veteran. I mean, it runs through history, through our Christian history, is the number of combat veterans. Do you know that Jan Breitenbach trained in the priesthood in Grahamstown?
Wow.
Did you
The
know?
top. No, I didn't know that. I
Yeah.
knew it in the UK, but
Colonel Breitenbach started training. He started training to become a minister at the Anglican seminary in Grahamstown in the 1990s or in the 1990s. He found that he was sort of politically a little bit ostracized, and so he dropped out. But you still see there the spiritual commitment, and you see it in his actions and his behavior towards trying to help the lives of 3-2 veterans, in the Northern Cape and so on. So you see it even with Jan Breitenbach and people like yourself and so on. Yeah, so those are the main themes. So if I had to sum it all up, I would say that from a traditional warrior point of view, when people are stuck in PTSD and are suicidal and stuff, it's very helpful to tell them that from a traditional warrior point of view, Sitting Bull or Shaka Zulu and so on, they would all understand exactly what you're going through. And they would say that you're an initiate. You're going through an initiation and you've suddenly been dropped and you're stuck halfway. So the suicidal impulse, what has to die is your old image of yourself. The initiation is that you are now being initiated onto the warrior's path of moral and spiritual development, which will last the rest of your life. You're no longer going to just have an ordinary civilian life. You can live in the civilian world creatively and well, but you'll never simply be merely a civilian again like others. So that means that you are now, and right now, you are an initiate onto the warrior's path. And we need to fulfill that initiation so that you can own, take up, and own with honor and humility, and including all the guilt and all the rest of it, but really so that you can enter the warrior's path for the rest of your life. And we can help you with that. That's what we say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then the suicide, Roger, that is, have you got time just to chat about that?
What I would say to veterans very briefly is, first of all, if you are suicidal, it feels as though suicide is the solution to your suffering. It's helpful to think of being suicidal as a measure of how lethal your suffering is. This is life-threatening, like being bitten by a bloody cobra. So think of it as like a measure of your suffering, not the solution to your suffering. So go and ask for help. Over 90% of the people who go and ask for help are no longer suicidal within a couple of months. Probably more than half are no longer suicidal after the first session or two, especially with somebody that they feel really understands them. And in fact, a lot of them are less suicidal just by making the appointment. That's the first thing I would say is even if you make the appointment, you will start to feel less suicidal. If this stuff is lethal, and go and get help. And if you get help, you go to somebody and he seems like he doesn't know what's going on and you don't feel you were helped, find somebody else. It just means that that person's not a good fit for you. So go and find somebody else. And then the next thing I would say as a general thing is that in the suicidal impulse, I think that we make a mistake if we just think, how can I help you want to look on the bright side or something? I think that the suicidal impulse, there are a whole lot of things that are going to, in a way, do have to die. When we think of who am I as a person, we have all sorts of images of ourselves, like I'm a good Catholic boy, or I'm a loving son, I was my dad's favorite, or my dad rejected me, and so I'm having to make it on my own, and I'm unlovable, or whatever the hell. I've got these images, all these images of myself, and what is going to die is actually some of these images that we have of ourselves. But when you wake up in the morning, your little heart is still beating away, your lungs are breathing, your legs are working, your blood is going around, you're still there. It feels like we're going to be falling forever or something, but we're not. We're going to land. And what will emerge is a much more mature, deeper, and more stable sense of ourselves and something that we can live with. So what will emerge is something that we feel we can live with instead of having an image of ourselves that we can no longer live with. And
It's
I'd really
amazing.
like,
And
and I'd really like to I'm really open to having conversations with you about what happened to you. What is calling for your attention in this wishing to
yeah,
die? What is it that you can no longer live with? Where do you go from here? Those are the sort of questions that I would try to enter that suicidal impulse.
thank you for your time, Roger. I really appreciate it.
But you're so welcome, buddy. It's really, really good to chat. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.